Hi, my name is Lindsay Behrens, and we're going to be creating collages together. So, to start off, we'll talk about a brief history of collage and look at some really cool examples. Then, we'll talk about things you should consider when creating a composition. And lastly, you'll watch me create a few different types of collage. Once we're all done with that, it's your turn to create a collage. So, let's get started. Before we get into a little collage history lesson, what actually is collage? Collage is a pretty broad form of art with many categories and options of materials to create with, but in the simplest terms, collage is the art of gluing said materials onto a surface. Now, these materials can be of some significance to the artist creating with them, but the materials can also be found objects, some sort of discarded item that might have an interesting quality in some way, or have the perfect amount of dullness to fit into the artist's vision for their work of art. Collage is basically taking these items and gluing them onto a surface in a visually pleasing or perhaps visually unpleasing way. The final outcome all depends on what the artist is going for. So the history to collage actually starts much earlier than you might expect. Back in the 12th century, it was a common practice in China and Japan to glue pieces of paper to objects, which we know as decoupage. This process made its way to medieval Europe, and by the 18th century became very popular among European royalty who used it to make items such as wall panels, screens, and fireboards. In fact, in the late 1700s, a 72-year-old woman named Mary Delaney began working in decoupage and made beautiful and scientifically accurate cut paper flowers. She created almost 1,000 of these collages before having to stop due to her failing eyesight. She certainly left behind an amazing collection of collage art. Once I started looking into Mary Delaney's artwork, I realized how beautiful these pieces really are, which is why I've included a few examples for you to look at. She might be my new favorite artist, and she's from 1772. How cool is that? There are other examples of paper cuttings made into creative pieces from Mary Delaney's time up until what we think of as the start of collage in the early 20th century, but it wasn't recognized as a legitimate form of art. It was more of a craft or a hobby. It wasn't until well-known fine artist Pablo Picasso incorporated collage in his painting, The Still Life with Chair Caning, in 1912, that it became accepted as art. Picasso and fellow artist George Braque paved the way for collage to open up into the art world. Let's also take a look at this artwork and try to notice what Picasso presents to us and decide which general category of art it fits into. We know by the title already that it is meant to be a still life, but as we carefully look across the entire canvas, we see a portion of a knife handle and blade that has cut pieces of citrus, maybe a lemon, and below that is a napkin with scalloped edges. To the left is a wine glass and newspaper, and at the bottom is the chair with the caned backing. It may take some doing to recognize these forms, but they are based on real-world objects. They are just painted in an abstracted manner. As with Picasso's still life, this piece titled Joy of Living by artist Robert Motherwell is an abstract collage. Abstract art itself feels like a broad topic with many subversions to it, but to keep it simple, abstract art derives from or is related to some sort of recognizable source. This can run the spectrum of being just a distorted version of a real-world person, place, or thing, or it may be a completely unrecognizable something that only holds the feeling or essence of the original subject matter. In Robert Motherwell's piece, it may not look like it's representing anything at first glance, letting it also fit into the category of non-representational art, but if you look closely, you'll notice some angled lines and shapes that could indicate an interior space, a military map in the upper right corner, blood staining on the lower left, along with smudges and scraps of fabric, and color usage, which gives it a connection to the World War II times, just in an abstracted way. It's not clearly a depiction of a war room, but once you start looking, you can recognize the connection to this era. This gives us a visual of abstract and non-representational art being used within the same piece. This piece made by, or depending on your take of it, presented by Jacques Villeglay, is a take on non-representational art. This art form uses the opposite approach to adding on papers or objects to create a collage by taking away papers that had already been adhered together. This is called décollage. This artist found walls in Paris that had layers of posters glued on top of each other, and he tore sections of them down. There were so many posters built up over time that his removing of sections by ripping showed both a history of information on the posters and became a work of art. The colors, textures from the wrinkled posters themselves, along with his torn edges, plus the choices Villeglay made to leave certain sections and remove others, also give a sort of unity to this piece. Moving on to representational art, in my opinion, this is one of the clearer categories of art. Representational art is art that represents the subject matter in a recognizable way. This piece by Patrick Bremer is clearly the portrait of a woman. Note that representational doesn't necessarily mean realistic. The woman's skin tone and hair color or texture is not what you would see in the real world, but you can definitely come to the quick conclusion what the overall subject matter is. If you zoom in and look closely at the small scraps collaged together, you may notice some other connections to the subject, but these scraps may have also only been used for the specific purpose of their color, texture, or shape to work within the portrait. This next piece, created by Matthias Young, in my opinion, is a mix between representational and conceptual art. Representational because we see that overall it is clearly architecture, but conceptual because the parts making up the whole intentionally create a more surreal, dreamlike feeling. This is our segue to conceptual art. Conceptual art is more about the concept than anything else. All art involves using techniques to communicate a concept or feeling. With concept art, the concept being communicated is more important than the technique being used. Some conceptual art may feel obvious to the viewer that there is a deeper meaning behind the piece, like in this one by Eugenia Lawley, more than just being a visually appealing picture. If you read through her description of this conceptual collage, she describes this piece as humans trying to ascend into a higher state of being. There is quite a bit of concept here, and I feel like the end result is quite visually pleasing. Some might say all art is conceptual, since in general every work of art has an idea behind it before it is made. Even if you were to create completely spontaneously and work in a stream of conscious fashion where you're not thinking but just doing, one might say that was the concept behind creating that particular piece. This has actually become a very interesting dialogue I've been having with my philosopher professor husband, but we agreed that the general idea behind conceptual art is that it's something based on or created out of a deeper meaning, and just how deep that meaning may be is up to the artist, and possibly the viewer if the artist hasn't hit us over the head with the obvious quote-unquote concept. Here's another example of conceptual artwork that I found to be aesthetically pleasing and interesting. What is this artist going for? Is Karen Lynch imagining an astronaut exploring a new life-giving planet? Or perhaps an astronaut from far away arrived here, on Earth, and is exploring what we have to offer. The artist might have just liked the combination of these visuals, and it is my interpretation as the viewer that brings me to the possible concept of exploring life somewhere, whether on Earth or maybe in another universe. How about this collage? Right on display at the New Britain Museum of American Art is this piece called Lo Simon, which is a good example of representational and conceptual art. If you look from far away, it looks like an aerial view photograph taken of a cityscape at night. But then you walk a little closer to it. And even closer. And then you begin to notice a few things all throughout the entire collage. When I first saw this piece in person from across the room, I just thought it was a photograph of a city at night and thought, that's nice. But I didn't give it much more thought than that until my husband called me over. Then I physically walked closer and even closer, and then I started noticing that all throughout the entire piece there were advertisements and figures layered all over the place. The artist, Gabi Trinkhaus, herself says that she was exploring society's preoccupation with mass media's sales pitch of the perfect life available if only one would buy a certain product. So she used advertisements of products throughout her entire piece to show this concept. And now we're going to get into discussing some good composition guidelines. This will come in handy whether you're planning on taking a visually interesting photograph with a camera, drawing a picture, or creating a collage. These guidelines are used to help you plan and make decisions for your own artwork so that the relationship between everything placed on your page works together and will therefore lead to a successful composition. A very helpful guideline or rule is the rule of thirds. This is where your composition is divided into thirds horizontally and vertically, and where these lines intersect, they create 4 power points, as I've indicated by the red circles. This is where you want to place your subject matter since it creates visual interest. You also want to try to avoid sticking something smack in the center because that's not as visually interesting as it would be if you placed it in the left or right third or upper or lower third. I thought this was a fun example of using the rule of thirds created by Eugenia Lully. You can see the horse located in the upper third, and you see the lower 2 thirds all taken up with the water. You also notice that the man rowing the boat is on one of the PowerPoints. So this is a great example of a visually interesting composition following the rule of thirds. This may look like your typical old-fashioned painting from the 1800s created by William Powell Frith of an affluent family sitting down at their dining room table celebrating something and enjoying a meal. But wait just a second. Artist Charlotte Corey had some fun with Powell's piece and created this one. This is a photo collage made on a print of the original painting we just looked at. Here you can see all of these animals taking on the forms of the people in that family having their special day. In this piece by Myri Timoni, we can see how she uses leading lines to draw your eye in from the outer edges of the composition towards the building in the center right. Color is the main factor I notice in this piece right away. Deja Mar uses warmer and cooler colors strategically throughout her entire composition, and it creates interest, especially in certain areas where there are really bright, bold colors. Your eye wants to travel through the shapes and the colors and follow where they direct you, especially toward the areas that hold the hot pink, yellow, and red shapes. This piece, made by Catherine Kuhn, is full of texture. She has different textures all over the place in this piece. on the walls, on the floor, in the woman's dress, on the bench. It's just texture, texture, all over the place. When thinking about using visual weight in your composition, something like this piece that Karen Lynch created is a really great example. You see these huge planets in the background, and they just look so heavy. It just gives that visual weight in such an obvious way compared to the tiny people collected on the beach in the foreground. And lastly, we're going to look at scale, which I think is pretty fun and obvious in this piece, again by Eugenia Lully. Having the gigantic child in the background compared to the mountain, along with the tiny people in front, who are regular sized compared to the mountain, makes it obvious that the artist wants our focus toward the child and what he's doing. And just because there's so much to look at and think about regarding collage, I figured I'd add in a few other processes and ideas to help get your creativity flowing when you need to come up with your own collage ideas. This abstract nude made by Matisse is a great example of color and also visual weight because the figure just looks so bold with her form and shape. This was made using gouache paint on paper and was cut and pasted on paper. So this can be an approach for you when making your collage, just painting or coloring on paper, cutting it up, and pasting it onto your final piece. Another fun approach that I liked was this one by Amy Ross. She creates a collection of hybrid creatures that are part human and part something else, this one being part sea creatures. She takes half from one part of the world and one half from another. Playing around making hybrids and morph something together could be kind of fun. Or maybe repurposing something like greeting cards, like Sassy Luke did for this piece right here. You can repurpose an old drawing or some piece of paper or an object you have and then transform it into a new work of art. This last example I thought was really beautiful by Jenny Brown is just made with pen and collage on paper. Notice how delicately she adds in her pen marks to these gorgeous combinations of flowers and leaves. And now for some examples that I've made for you to check out. Let's start with an abstract digital collage piece that I made. I created a time lapse for it so you could see my process of picking and choosing and layering pieces to build up my collage. So you notice here that I started off with some landscape pieces and a few photos of some pattern pieces. So I'm just playing around with seeing how I think things look together. I decide on certain areas that I want to cut out and then see how it looks overlapping something else, and I go back and forth just trying it out. So it really is a lot of playing to see how everything fits together and playing to see maybe what kinds of shapes and colors things should be to have it work. So I turn those feathers into these crazy shapes within the forest and also into this little creature that is walking across that walkway right in the middle. Now it's time to play with some physical collage materials. So let's get started. Okay, you may be wondering why I have all of these scraps and objects out here in front of you to look at today. Well, I have a couple of reasons. First reason is I've actually been collecting a lot of these things for a while in case I wanted to make a work of art out of one of them or a few of them, whether it would be a mixed media piece, adding on painting or whatever, or if I wanted to create a collage like what we're going to be doing together today. And the other reason is to show you the various options of things you can choose from. So basically anything that could be of interest to you is what you should try to start collecting. So things that I found interesting were some old pieces of wrapping paper, like these pieces over here, and I actually trimmed out parts of them to see if I might want to use a part to create some sort of collage with. And then I have this, which is a wrapping for a soap I bought about 5 years ago, but I just thought the roses were so beautiful. I thought maybe I could do some sort of collage paper layering with that. I also have a little collection of stamps. I have a lot of stamps, and here are just a select few of them, but maybe I could create something with those. I have another package over here from a perfume I got because I thought all the detail from the package, the box, was just so pretty with the gold detailing on it that maybe that could come in handy too. Even something like this really beautiful collection of feathers, the colors of them, the texture, the pattern, any of that could be used, as well as old wilted roses, rose petals that I've kept because I've glued these onto paintings. You could create it into your collage. Even something like little beads, anything that's going to be able to glue on to paper that's, nothing really heavy like a rock, unless it's like tiny little light pebbles, but you don't want anything too heavy or it's gonna tear apart your paper. But something light like little beads could totally be used in a collage. And then this kind of shimmery paper. As you can see, I do like having kind of a shimmery look in some of these, and just like the pattern, all this detailing here. I even have some old pages out of an old dictionary, you can use the text from that if you had something like an old road map or a brochure or sheet music. Some of these other pieces right here, these are works of art that I had created a while back that I just tore up. This one is from a screen print I tore up and thought I could cut apart and make into something. And this right here is just scrap paper from watercolor painting. And it's just me cleaning off my brushes and maybe practicing some brush strokes and mark making right in here. But that could be really cool to cut up and make into some kind of shape of something right here. I could have these kind of things added into a collage, and then more wrapping paper. So here are just a selection of things that I've come up with. This is kind of my edited version from my giant collection of pieces that I've saved over the years. And then I'm gonna have to edit down from here. But this is a great starting point. My next collage I'm going to show you is a representational example. So to show you how I go about doing this, I had the idea of doing something with a ballerina, so I'm just showing you how I went about planning it out with selecting an image, a pose of a ballerina, and getting her sketched out because I wanted it to look real, as close to real as I was going to get for a collage piece. Next, you'll see how I chose some of my objects and papers and things and played around with deciding and seeing what I thought was going to work for my ballerina. I decided on the flower petals, but then I still have all of these other objects that I want to decide what I'm going to use from. So I took a lot of time carefully cutting out my shapes so that everything looked nice all together. And I picked and chose certain pieces based on what I was going for. I wanted my ballerina to be dancing on a landscape, dancing in nature. So picking out landscape pieces and colors that I thought would fit. I also had some hand painted paper that I cut out for the grass in some areas. And then I decided to use some colored pencil to add in to the ballerina. So you can do a combination of materials. I painted the background in case I had any spots missed from adding on paper to the sky, so you can choose to do something like that if you want. And then you just notice how I carefully cut and built up all the pieces around this dancer to get the look that I was going for. You'll even notice how I use tracing paper to help me get certain precise shapes and sizes that I wanted to fit in. So that is a trick that you could use too. And there it is. There's my ballerina. And now for my conceptual piece. This piece was surprisingly much faster for me to put together than my representational piece. But maybe not so surprising, because I did take my time to carefully cut out all of these pieces in preparation for whichever of my collages I was going to maybe use them for. So I organized everything, and then I picked and chose to see how I was going to put it together. And my original idea was going to be something based on those mirrors or the windows with fragility and strength. And as I was putting everything together, it became something completely different. I decided to do a take on a dreamscape. And here we are at the end. So now it's your turn. Have fun!